Hey there, everyone. Sarah Brown-Westling here. Really excited to use this new format to share some classroom ideas with you. So today I'm going to share how to create poetry comics. If you or your students are a little bit leery about poetry, think it's a little bit scary, this can be a really creative way to get into poetry and do it in a way that I think kind of diminishes some of that intimidation factor. So one of the things that I really love about PoetryComics is that it combines three things. It combines summary, interpretation, and representation, all within this same lesson. So let's take a look here at what one of these poetry comics looks like. It looks a lot like you would imagine. It's a storyboard where students take a poem and they take the words and they assign images to it. So this particular poem is Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty, and you can see how this particular group decided to represent that. Here's the same poem, a completely different interpretation of it, you can see. And I love the way both of these groups take the same poem and then have like these really different ways of thinking about it. So summary, students have to be able to understand what's going on in the poem. Interpretation, they have to be able to interpret it in order to figure out how to draw it and the colors that they want to use and the way that they want to represent it. And then finally, representation. One of the things that poets do that's so important for our students to take in and to understand is the way that they use imagery and the way they use words in order to represent ideas. And so essentially in a poetry comic, we're asking students to do the same thing. We're asking them to use color and image and form in order to represent ideas. So in that way, I think it's just this really great kind of reciprocal way of thinking about the work. So if you want to do poetry comics, I've got 4 steps to get you started. Step number 1 is to start with a small collection of poems. Here's what I prefer. I prefer a small collection, about 5 to 7, like shorter poems for this particular activity. So maybe 3 to 4 stanzas each, something like that. And I love choice because especially when it comes to poetry and students might be nervous about it, or again, they get intimidated, just giving them choice kind of lessens some of that. The second thing to do is to decide how you're going to group your students. So are you going to let them create the groups? Or are you going to create the groups? I know that right now creating groups might be kind of really different than it usually is. So another way to think about this assignment is to think about maybe dividing up portions of a poem and having a group of students each take a different portion of it. However, I would say this. I don't think it's an individual assignment. So even if you want students to individually do a portion of the work, I think you have to give them a chance to collaborate because so much of this work is happening in that conversation, as they talk about, well, how should we represent this? And what should this look like? And what colors should we use? So I think it's important to remember that. The third thing is, I think, to build their confidence. You can do a think aloud, a practice text. You can show them some examples. So maybe take a poem you've already read together, take the first stanza. You could talk about how you would create the first storyboard using that first stanza of a poem you already know. You could do one together, or you could take a really easy poem and kind of practice. You can take pictures of the examples or the work that you get this year and use those as examples next year. So that would also be another great tool. The fourth thing is that if you haven't yet talked about how to use color and image, this would be a really great opportunity to talk about how to use color and image in purposeful ways. So you can talk about all the different ways that red represents emotions and how is that different than the color black, and how is that different than the color yellow, and what is the purpose of a circle versus a triangle or a square. So you're really getting them to start to think metaphorically, right? And so I think that's really, really key. Here is a teaching tip. So once you give those poems to students and they make those choices and they're in those groups, don't give them the materials that they're going to need until they've had time to read and talk about the poem and start to imagine how to represent it. So even if your students are not together, like literally together, sitting around a table with markers and colored pencils, if they are virtual, you still want to give them a chance to talk to each other and look at the poem before they jump right into the representation. Otherwise, it just kind of becomes a task to complete, right? I also don't think that they have to have a complete and full understanding of the poem in order to get started, because I've always found that when students do this, they come to a deeper understanding of the poem through the work. So I think that's, really key. Here is another example of a different one. And I like this one because it doesn't really use a storyboard as much as it uses a progression. And so I'd love to kind of share that one as well. So finally, I just want to say, I think it's really important for students to somehow share their work. So whether it's like reflecting on the process and sharing that reflection, or maybe it's some kind of small group presentation, I really think that part of the learning is in the explanation of what's been created. So I hope that you enjoy this. I hope that there are poetry comics in the future of your classrooms. Take some pictures, send them my way. I'd love to see them. Take care, everybody. Have a great week.